The Radical Secular Podcast, a demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, insights, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon and follow us on social media.
Welcome to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Joe Kipinti.
I'm Sean Prophet.
Today, we're going to skip our usual news segment and get right into the discussion of our main topic. And that is a proposal for a completely new Constitution of the United States, which is very detailed and systematic vision to fit our contemporary world, and in particular, the challenges that we face. Our guest today is Mr. Alan Dechert, Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Committee for Open Source Global Governance. We are grateful and excited he is here, and I can tell you that I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. But before we get to any of that, I want to remind you to make sure to subscribe, hit the like button if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment or a review, and most importantly, tell your friends to listen. And if you're in a position to support our show, please head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/theradicalsecular. We really appreciate your support. New episodes of the show post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish news articles in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. And now, Sean, please, would you kindly introduce our guest?
Yes, certainly. Alan, welcome to the show, and we're so glad that you decided to join us today.
Glad to be here.
Well, before we get started, I want to read a short bio so people understand a bit about your background. Growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, Alan Dechert noticed an incomprehensible paradox. Humanity had seen incredible progress in many ways, but civilization was still in poor condition. Wars, violence, famine, environmental catastrophes, inequities, and corruption dominated the news. In the 1970s, while a student at UC Berkeley, it came to him, his grand idea for how to resolve these age-old contradictions. The idea was too big for the usual modes of presentation. He would have to break it down into manageable pieces. Instead of a book, he wrote articles. Instead of one massive political campaign, he got involved in several. In 2017, he decided to roll up all his projects into one all-inclusive Change the World project, a new system of global governance which will require constitutional reform for the United States and the world. So, Alan, this means writing not just one new constitution for the United States, it also means writing a new constitution for the world, which proposes an entirely new federation of nations called the Human Federation. Clearly, these are both huge undertakings, and getting them adopted will be a very tall order. But that is right up our alley here at the Radical Secular, since we're very future-oriented. We talk a lot about Star Trek and the ideals of the United Federation of Planets, so we obviously don't see any problem at all with thinking big. Shooting for the stars, after all, requires some very detailed plans. And so, Alan, I think you've made great progress toward nailing down a lot of very important details. Before we dive into that, though, let's do our t-shirt segment, which has become a Radical Secular tradition.
So let me tell you about my t-shirt. Of all the shows I've done so far, and I've worn this before, I think this is the most apt time that I've sported this one. Just a one earth, one system, one reality. And it is an image that evokes grand ideas, and ideas are important as they guide our actions. What I would say is that the core ideas that guide humanity are under transformation. The old hierarchies are dissolving. Today's topic, I truly believe, is an expression of a growing realization that there is a new path. We are seeing a shift in human consciousness, and I don't say that in a vague spiritual sense, but in a real down-to-earth sense. Yes, Trumpism has been tremendously upsetting, but don't be disheartened by populist right-wing backlashes that seek to hold on to the old order. This reaction was bound to happen. This transformation is not about becoming one world. We have always been one world, one community, one interconnected system. The transformation is that humanity is becoming more and more aware of that reality. That is the change that spurs us on. Change in thinking manifests as new ways of doing things. This process already started, and so here we are. And now, Sean, you tell me about your shirt.
Okay. Well, I'm wearing one that I've worn before, but I think it's also appropriate for today. It says, "There is no planet B." And I'm saying here at this point that the political crisis is leading us to a planetary physics crisis, which has already begun with what many people are now calling the sixth mass extinction, which so far concerns primarily non-human species. But the way things are going, the climate crisis and the accompanying political instability are beginning to threaten human life support as well.
Indeed, Sean. And likewise, I think let's look upon the climate challenge, although it is truly horrific, as a great opportunity for humanity because it is literally forcing all of us to understand the existential necessity for global unity. And the same with the pandemic. It is not so different in that regard than the threat of right-wing backlash that forces us to confront the brutalities of the old order and seek truth and reconciliation. Having to go through all this sucks, but that's the nature of change. It is wild, contradictory, and all too painful. Expect this brutality and the uncertainties, and do not ever let it sap your will or give in to despair. We do have a fighting chance. And so we could surely use a new set of laws and principles that reinvigorate our civil society, give us direction, and propels us towards the world we want to see. A conversation about law requires far more time than is possible in one episode. And that's even to discuss a proposed new U.S. Constitution, leaving aside the new Constitution for the Human Federation. So really, our goal here today is for Alan to illuminate some key philosophical principles, give us some specific as time permits, and to propose actions. As informed and conscientious citizens, we all need a clear direction. Let us both be thoughtful and forge a way forward. They go together after all.
Indeed.
Question 1. Alan, give us your basic pitch to start with. What is the Committee on Open Source Governance all about? What's essentially your statement of purpose, or as much of that as you can describe in a few minutes?
Well, the Committee for Open Source Global Governance was actually, the name itself came out of a contest that was started by the Global Challenges Foundation. And I had to make up this name because I used several names. The Human Federation idea, I did the first draft of the Human Federation Constitution in the 1990s because I was in discussions like this one and talking about my ideas, and people would say, well, why don't you write it down? Why don't you write it down? And I'm not a lawyer. I had no idea how to do that. And so I did the first draft, and it was in the late 1990s, and it was before Google. And actually, at that time, this kind of prompted partly by what Sean said about the Human Federation, because I haven't heard that too much. But at that time, I put up a page on Human Federation in the late 90s. This is before Google, and we used something called Alta Vista. And when I remember that. When I did a search on Human Federation, there was one page that came up, one page, and that was mine. And awesome. And I checked over the years, and you know what started coming up later with Human Federation was comic books but it was kind of depicted correctly in that it was the humans out beyond the earth and it's still bound together by this federation. And some people think that name came from Star Trek or something, but it didn't. It came from me, and it was in the late 1990s. Some people asked me, where should it be? So I first proposed it in the United States, and then there was some people from Europe on it, and they didn't like that. And so I searched around, and I actually put out some feelers, and I wrote a letter to the mayor of a major city in Australia, and he wrote back, and it says it's in Western Australia, and he said, well, you have to get the approval of the Western Australian government and the national government, but we think it'd be okay. This is the city of Perth,
Yeah.
And I like.
Okay.
I was interested in Perth because we're looking at swords to plowshares, right? That's one of the things we want to do. We want to have a boneyard, and they have lots of dry land to take equipment to, and it's near the ocean, so you should be able to bring all the boats in there and then just start unloading. So anyway, that was kind of part of the idea, but that's kind of the standing. That's the only place that I know of that has said, yeah, we'll host it. But now, what was your question, Joe?
Just an intro, just a basic pitch, basically.
Right. Basically, yeah, it's swords to plowshares. That's what we want to do. Mm-hmm. And peace is a human right. The U.S. Constitution there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a right to peace. The federal government has the right to send citizens to war, but they have no right to peace. And right. So my idea was that we need to burn that into the Constitution. And of course, it won't be any good if it's unilateral with the United States. You've got to have agreement with other countries. And one of the things that a lot of people have thought is that, well, gee, we could come up with that in the United States, and then we can't get any other countries. But actually, history shows that the opposite is true, because
it certainly does.
100 years ago, Wilson proposed a League of Nations, and that by the mid-30s, I think something like 58 nations had joined, and that includes Italy, Japan, and Germany. They were in it. And people were expecting the United States to join, and the Senate said, "There's no way. There's no way, because this negates the role of the commander-in-chief and all of that. We lose our sovereignty. Other countries have been willing to give up a little part of their sovereignty to go for collective security, and the United States had said no 100 years ago. Although all these other countries were willing to do it. And the outcome of that failure was that Japan, Italy, Germany left the League of Nations. And then you got World War II.
Yeah, we know what happened after that, yeah.
And so it's a horrific error on the part of this country, America, to think that we want peace and nobody else does that. Nobody else does. It's the opposite is true. And so that's, both constitutions have a clause that peace is a human right, and that countries would not have the right to declare war or send your kids to war or anything like that. And it would ban, I know one of your questions had to do with weapons. The U.S. Constitution that I have drafted, it eliminates the Second Amendment, of course, but doesn't eliminate all. It leaves it to the states for handguns and so forth. But as far as military weaponry, that would be illegal across the board. Citizens have there's no justification for citizens to have military weaponry. And so that would be completely banned. So that's a realization that you have to do both if you're going to have peace. You have to have, and what we have now is international anarchy. There's no referee. We've been sort of the world cop, right? Mm-hmm. And not done a very good job, because Vietnam, Afghanistan, these are prime examples of wars that were unwinnable and
fraudulent.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there needs to be, in Europe, they tried to come up with the International Criminal Court, but the United States isn't going to join that. So we have to somehow come up with constitutions that are acceptable to both the United States and enough nations. The whole world doesn't have to, but certainly the major powers do. And so we think we can, that's the goal, is to get enough of them so that others will join, because you need the major powers. And that's, you could also say that was true for the United States because, for example, when the convention happened in 1787, Rhode Island just said, we're not going to go. And you can't do it because it has to be unanimous, right? And they just did it anyway. And so, but they knew that to get the Constitution ratified, they needed New York, they needed Virginia, they needed the major countries. And even if they put in there that 9 states had to join in order for the United States to exist, and which is not 3/4, by the way. Article 5 says 3/4, but 9/16 is 69%. But they didn't go by percentages. They knew they had to have New York, and they had to have a couple other major states. And right now, I think that we don't need a certain percentage of countries to join. Obviously, we need the major powers.
I see the parallel you're drawing there. What do you think, Sean?
Well, I think we have our hawks and our hardliners and our nationalists and people who would want nothing to do with any of that. But I still say that there is power in the proposal, and I wanted to point out for our listeners that all of this documentation is in the frequently asked questions section, has a lot more information at theanswer.fyi, and the full text of the new constitutions are also there. So that's theanswer.fyi, and we'll put that link also in the show notes.
Yeah, we definitely will do that. In the video introduction on your site, Alan, you make the very strong point that the purpose of government can be summed up in the 4 words from the Declaration of Independence, quote, to secure these rights, unquote. Since there are widely divergent views as to what those rights and words imply, I want to get more specific. I'm going to name key principles in the U.S. Constitution, and I would like to discuss what could be improved and how your proposed Constitution, Alan, addresses these core principles. They are popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and of course, our favorite here at the Radical Secular, the separation of church and state. Now, I know you're super excited about strategies for getting this new constitution actually adopted, and there's nothing wrong with thought experiments. We love those here in our show, but we sorely need a sea change in our government. So I want to hear your specific plans for making that happen. First, though, I want to make sure our listeners really understand in detail exactly what it is you're proposing. And let's start with the first core principle, popular sovereignty, meaning that the people are ultimately the source of the authority of their government and can abolish that government if they choose so. This principle is truly at the core of a democratic/republican form of government. What can you tell our viewers about how your constitutional vision is an improvement for the protection of popular sovereignty?
Well, the whole thing is based on popular sovereignty, and it's not this isn't something that exists apart from this Constitution. I mean, our current Constitution was based on popular sovereignty in that the country was founded not by going to the powers that exist, whether it's in Europe or Mexico or anywhere around here. It was that the people could decide this themselves, and that overrides anything else. And that was stated in the Declaration of Independence, that whenever people think that the government isn't living up to what they think it should be, they have the right to replace it. So we kind of feel like for the last 230 years that we did a pretty good job, and we haven't had a serious reason to exercise popular sovereignty. And there is now, we feel that there's nobody in government that's going to initiate this. And I'll make a segue here to General MacArthur, who was, when World War II ended, and for his last 15 years, 20 years after that, he advocated tirelessly for the complete abolition of war. And when one of his speeches, he says, when will some great, some person of power decide it's time? And I think that he was wishing that maybe Eisenhower would, because he was the general that he felt probably would become president and did. But Eisenhower didn't have the wherewithal to do that. Although he did state that was an ultimate goal, he didn't have a plan for how to make that happen. So it's wrong to think that some great leader is going to do this. This is up to the people. The people have to do this. The great leaders in this world right now are pretty well off. They've got cushy positions, and they're not willing to give it up. It's going to be it's going to take a grassroots movement that grows and grows and grows until the leaders have to go along with it. And so that's the idea of popular sovereignty. It's not something that we hang our shingle on and say, this is a right that we have. That's already been done. That's in the Declaration of Independence, basically. It's up to the people to do this. It's up to the people right now to exercise popular sovereignty that they have. They have that strength. They have that capability. They just have to be convinced that now is the time to do it. And we have more tools to exercise that than ever. I mean, people didn't have, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have all of these tools we have right now. And we can have these video conferences and so forth. It costs nothing, really. All this stuff exists now that didn't exist. We didn't. The potential wasn't there so much 200 years ago, 300 years ago that exists today. So, and we have more reason to do it today, and we have more capability to do it. So people have to be convinced that now's the time, and that we have the right idea to move forward, and the things that the people want. And so in the United States, for example, some of this was stated by Bernie, in his campaign, but Bernie didn't have he was weak on specifics. For example, healthcare. I mean, I've got healthcare as a human right in the U.S. Constitution as I've drafted it. It's number 13, and those things are spelled out. Roe v. Wade is the fact that women have the choice, the ability to choose. That's actually fairly popular, despite Texas. It's fairly popular, and so we want to federalize it. And in the draft, that's clause 5 in Article 13, and that was actually written by a constitutional scholar by the name of Michael Dorff. And I don't mind mentioning his name because that was in a public discussion on Facebook. I asked him, "Can you write this up for us?" And by the way, Nancy Pelosi asked for this language recently. She's from listening to Texas, she said she asked for constitutional language to federalize this Roe v. Wade, and I already had it. She didn't know that. But I already had this language, and I already put it in there. So, but there are a lot of things like that there's like 50 changes in the Constitution that I incorporated, and they need to be in there. And I would say that racism is maybe the worst problem we've ever had. We with the treatment of the Native Americans, calling them Indians. They called them Indians so they could. And I think for example, a Trump supporter once, I saw him on tape going up to a Native American and saying, "Go back to where you came from." That's the kind of craziness. That was used, a psychological trick.
Absurd.
To make them look like they're foreigners. And it was known that they weren't from India. 200 years later when they drafted the Constitution, but they kept it in there anyway.
Well,
because
yeah, and this brings up a point that I wanted to make, and that is that from the very beginning, okay, there was disenfranchisement of anyone who wasn't white, male, and landowner, right? That's basically who the Constitution was written for. I think you acknowledged that in your previous video, but what I was surprised about is that, in the new Constitution that you propose, there's still non-proportional representation of 2 senators from each state, and that gives a permanent advantage to low population states. And the second is the Electoral College, which has allowed the election of 5 presidents in U.S. history who did not win the popular vote. Now, the reason why we have all this mistreatment and racism and all that is because of the dominance of these low population states. And so why did you leave those structurally undemocratic provisions in the new Constitution? And how do you resolve that with the idea of popular sovereignty?
The Electoral College, as it's written in the draft, is much different. It's not the same, and you have to take a careful look at it to see how it works.
Okay.
It is.
Oh, how so?
It is much different. There won't be the probability of a popular vote winner or loser winning the election is very, very low because of the way it's structured. But I don't want to get into those. That's really nitty gritty details.
Okay.
But as far as the power of the low population states, I want to make this point very, very clear. When they got together to draft a new constitution, equal suffrage for the states was the mantra. And that meant that Connecticut would have just as much power as New York in the legislature. And it was hard to come up with a compromise on that. And it's called the Connecticut Compromise. And what it said was that we're going to have equal suffrage in the Senate, but we'll have proportional representation in the House. So it was a pretty good compromise. And it does leave a proportional, it leaves the small states with more power than they would have under equal suffrage or if they were both proportional, but it's still a pretty good compromise. And as far as the presidential elections, as I was mentioning to Sean, you really have to look at the way. I wrote a whole article on elections, and that's actually where I'm kind of recognized as an authority. Is I started the Open Source Voting Foundation in 2000 actually, and right as soon as the ink was dry when Gore lost. So there's a whole article on elections, and it's quite a bit different. There won't be it eliminates the spoiler role because there will be a runoff. It's a true runoff. It's not instant runoff because instant runoff is error prone, and so you have an actual runoff. Anyway, it's Article 7 it carries in a lot of experience that I had in all of these forums that I was on over, since 2000, and lots of these discussions. And you have to read it very carefully to understand why it's much, much better, and it's not the same system, really.
Well, I think we should definitely put something about that in the show notes. And I'm not trying to be hypercritical here at all, because there's a tremendous amount of great improvements that you have in the Constitution about elections.
The other point I want to make about that is that unlike the 1787 Constitution, we're proposing to do this by the book, getting 3/4 of the states in the United States, and most states are small states. Most states are small states. You only need 13 states to nix anything as far as a constitutional amendment goes. This was the Connecticut Compromise. The 1787 Constitution proceeded after that compromise. It wasn't going to go anywhere because they came into that saying equal suffrage for the states. So the large states had had to give them the Senate as far as equal suffrage to get proportional representation in the House. And you're back to square one if you're trying to take that away from them. I don't think there is a point to even debate. They're not going to do it. So we've got to let them have. We've got to let them have the extra power, and it's not a big deal because the big states do have all the power. You know, with the legislation and frankly with electoral college, they still have. California still has 50 what?
But you've seen those maps though. You've seen the maps where it shows Los Angeles County and then it shows like 20 states, right? Los Angeles County has more people than 20 states.
That's an emotional appeal. It doesn't mean anything. Because that's the Senate. It's not the whole government. That's the Senate.
Yeah, but you see what's going on in the Senate right now. I mean, you see what's going on. They're blocking everything, and only because of 2 senators. And so it's like, I get this,
so
right?
We're going to blow that away. We're going to blow all that away. All this stuff, they're going to deny Roe v. Wade, or they're going to allow Texas to deny Roe v. Wade. We're not going to let that happen. So the new Constitution is going to blow all that away, and those guys are all going to be fired. By the way, this is the new government. All those people are gone.
So in terms of the proportionality for states, this state suffrage, the reason to keep it is just strategic, you're saying, so that you can get 3/4 of the states to go along with this new constitution. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, that's a good part of it, but I think that's something you can't, like I said, the 1787 Constitution proceeded from the Connecticut Compromise. And I think if you try to take that away, you're back to square one with the whole thing. And I don't know where you're going, because what we're really after are, there are a couple of articles on equality in both the Human Federation and the United States. There's no statement of equality in the United States Constitution, none.
Right.
And that has allowed us to kill the gooks, the Japs, and to look at brown people as inferior, and we have no recognition of the larger issue of equality of all people. And in Japan, I don't know if you know this story, but in the Treaty of Versailles, Japan asked for an addition of a statement of equality in the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted a recognition that people of all races are.
I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, actually, and if you notice, Japan was on our side in World War I, and they became our enemy in World War II. And this is in no small part the reason that they were livid that because they made that proposal and it looked like it would be in there, and then it was denied. It is not in the Treaty of Versailles. So we could continue to look down on Japanese as well as Chinese and people of color in general, and that has enabled the war machine to. I mean, if you look at the military-industrial complex, and they're building new weapon systems, they're projecting you're going to be fighting the Chinese, or they're going to be fighting these other wars and so forth. But they're always brown people, right?
It's always people of color, always.
Yeah.
So.
And we need to establish that. I mean, the equal suffrage in the Senate is a tiny issue compared to those kinds of issues.
Yes and no, though, because here's the thing, is that if you have a 50-50 Senate, all right, right now, the Democrats are representing 40 million more people than the Republicans with 50 Senate members, right? So it is a permanent minority rule. And I appreciate the pickle that we're in, though, in terms of trying to get this ratified by 75% of the states. You have to throw them a bone, but ultimately you're still in a situation where you lack proportional representation, and that poses a huge problem, especially because if you're worried about discrimination against people of color, those low population states are almost overwhelmingly white, and so they tend to block policies that would help people of color, and they tend to be very anti-urban in their rhetoric. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I'll put it this way. The draft that I have out there is what I put together. And I spent a lot of time over many years, as I mentioned earlier, the first talks about a new constitution, both for the world and the United States, I was involved in that in the 90s. Well, actually the 80s as well. And you can find a speech I gave in 1986. And actually I got very good feedback from Ron Dellums, who was chair of the Armed Services Committee. And he didn't comment on anything except for the proposal for eliminating war-making powers. That's what he commented on. And his letter is on my website, or it's on my Facebook, by the way. But so it goes back a long ways, and I spent a lot of time trying to build a team of law professors, prominent law professors, and I could never get them together. I could never get anybody to commit to take control of it. And I had to do this myself. I had to just, make it happen. And the idea right now is that we'll get delegates. I mean, it's not the constitutions that are going to be put before the states and the countries is not what's on our website right now. There's a whole process that has to happen. The delegates, we have to get delegates and from all the states and all the countries, and they're the customers. They're the ones that are going to have the final say on what goes in it. And I don't yet know, but I mean, I had to put something out there to start with.
Fair point.
And it's a great start. If we just name off all the stuff that you did do here, okay, like mandatory universal voting, you've banned gerrymandering and set up computer-drawn districts by algorithm. You've provided for people to be able to vote electronically on their personal computing devices. You've got these. One of my favorite things that I love is your procedure for vetting the skills of candidates and having them examined by experts to see if they understand the government that they're trying to they're proposing to run.
That's radical.
Right? But it's great though, and then you incorporate also some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act into the Constitution itself, and you put in place public funding of elections, strict contribution limits. All that stuff is super great. And I can also see that being really tough to sell to people who have heavily vested interest in the status quo.
Well, anyway, we could talk about this for the rest of the show, but let's move forward. Okay, as my job as a moderator, I got to be the tough guy here. Let's address one of the key features that is notably mentioned by conservatives. That's limited government. The idea that legalized force and power is restricted through delegated and enumerated authorities. What goes along with that are the rights of the individuals that are enshrined into law. This question is a thorny one because it is at the center of the discursive strategies the right uses to try to restrict government from ensuring human basic needs and limiting the powers of corporations. So question 3, Alan, the question I have for you is, how do you address this conundrum? How does your Constitution better balance the need of society, the public good, with the autonomy of the individual?
Very good question. There are a few things that I've written in there that should be obvious. I have a whole section on local governors and strengthening local government. Also, we have the military-industrial complex and oil are both tools of the rich and powerful, and to a certain extent we're ruled by the military-industrial complex, and we're gonna erase that. It's going to be erased. Do you understand? we're going to shift power to local government more and more. And also, when we move to renewable energy, there's no more bowing down to oil companies and to being. We're no longer dictated by foreign powers that we have to buy oil from anymore. But still, we're not out from underneath this oil conundrum. And we're going to be completely done with that. And I might also add, this is something that's not apparent, but in California, we did this. It's in law now, and that we're doing away with non-renewable energy, and it's in the law. And I was involved in that for a long, long time. And it was in 2018 we got SB 100. And California has a lot of power, and other states are going to go along with it. And we're banning the sale of gasoline-powered automobiles by 2035, and the whole industry is moving that way now. So, and I'll just tell you a story now. I don't mean to take up too much of your time, but
go for it.
Because some people think, well, California is this bizarre, different place and so forth. But in Jerry Brown's first term, and this is in the 1970s, there was a luncheon, and part of the topic was the Sun Desert Nuclear Power Plant. And across the table from Jerry was a Lawrence Berkeley Lab scientist. And he said, if you just made refrigerators as efficiently as they could be, because the compressors, they know how to make compressors that are twice as efficient. He says you could save more energy than that nuclear power plant could ever produce. And Jerry Brown went back to the office, and he's got quite a technical staff, and they did a lot of research, and the Lawrence Berkeley Lab guy was right. He knew what he was talking about. And so he made regulations, and he said, you're not going to sell refrigerators unless they use about half as much power as they do now, because we know you can do it. We know you can do it. And all of the major makers, Maytag, Westinghouse, everybody said, "Oh, you guys in California, you're communists. You're crazy. We're not going to do it. We're not going to be selling. Where are you going to make? You're going to have to make your own refrigerators." And then eventually, somebody said, "Yeah, we could do it." And
you think?
And they all complied. All of them did. But it wasn't just California, because they didn't have a California refrigerator and then an inefficient one for Nevada. It didn't make any sense. So they all did. Not only California, not only the United States, but the whole world.
Well, and the same is true for California emissions standards, right? I mean, the California led the emission standards for decades, really, and brought the whole country along with it. So.
And they're doing this with renewable energy, and it's there. You can find an article where Massachusetts is saying we're going to ban new sales of gasoline-powered cars by 2035, and then all of these other states are going along the same way. And there's a lot of countries in Europe that have already adopted that. So it's a done deal. And now all of the manufacturers major manufacturers are saying we're going to have a electric car lineup by 2030 or so. So it's in a sense, my draft is saying we're going to move to renewable energy, and this is the solar era after all. But it's happening anyway. But it's a good thing to have it in law so that everybody knows where we're going. There's no question about it, and that gas stations are going to go away. And you can plan for that. Some people don't believe it. I still have discussions once in a while, and people don't believe they think that gasoline stations will be here forever, and they're not going to be. They're going to go look at getting a video from Blockbuster. They're gone. It's obsolete, and gasoline cars are going to be obsolete. It's hard for people to know that, but it's good to nail these things down, and then we're going to do that, and that's going to, in getting back to power in the communities. It's when we're getting our energy locally, it's going to be a lot different than being dominated by a few large oil companies. So because energy is everywhere, every job that anybody has, it requires energy to make that job happen and to function, and it's extremely important. And if we're a renewable energy economy is going to look a lot different. And one of the features of the price structure, for example, in a renewable energy economy, is that costs are going to stabilize at some point, and they're going to go down because the price of the basic energy is free, and we're only paying for these energy collection systems and distribution, and we're getting better and better at that. And as we get better, the price goes down. Whereas we're in an opposite field right now with fossil fuel. It's going up, and there's nowhere as it becomes less available, it's going to continue to go up, and so it's hard to imagine how different the solar era is going to be, and the solar economy is going to be, but it's going to be a lot better and cleaner, you know.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there, but one of the things I want to take it back to the question, and I think what I hear you saying is that we need to reinvigorate the public good. We provide stimulus in terms of regulations and so forth to the private realm, and then they go at it and they do the thing that makes sense once that happens. But ultimately, what we really need to do is think pragmatically here. This is a problem that needs to be solved. We need green energy. And so that's the role that the government should have, and the Constitution should be supporting that. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Exactly. You know, energy is weaved throughout our infrastructure.
Absolutely.
And it is a matter of public policy. You can't bring power to people's homes and to their vehicles without public policy. It just cuts through everything.
I think,
you need,
absolutely.
The governments need to step up to that, and we have to figure out where we're going, and nail that down so that everybody knows this is where we're going. I do want to add something about separation of powers that is fairly important, that is included there, and that is, I don't know if you noticed that the executive is divided by. The president has a lot less power, and this also goes back to concerns about the small states having too much power in electing the president. In our draft, in the Constitution, as I've outlined it, the president has he's no longer commander in chief, and he has a much less power. I mean, right now the president has life and death authority over everybody. Right, that won't exist. And the other thing is, in this, the executive is divided. There's an attorney general is now an executive of the executive branch, and is elected. And in that election, that is, and it's laid out there how he's going to be elected. There's no electoral college, right? It's purely.
Right. That's true. That's a very powerful position. So I'm glad you mentioned separation of powers. That's actually the next question I was going to ask you. So we got with that one covered. Sean, do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I have my own. Like, I think it is very. Like when I thought about this, first thought about your idea of making the attorney general and executive, like light bulbs are going on, because it is such a powerful position. We think back to some of the various attorneys general, like, from Bill Barr to what was Reagan, Ed Meese.
Meese, yeah.
And then the other guy, Ashcroft. Ashcroft was terrible. I mean, you think about what kind of an influence these guys have on the country, and it's super important. And so, and having them have a different term of 10 years, so they overlapped. I thought that was very creative and good too. because there are overlapping administrations. You have some continuity of justice, and you also have a Justice Department that people can count on, right? So, I mean, I have my own specific judicial reforms in mind. I think I might have mentioned it in the email. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think jury trials are a big problem, and I don't know if you agree, if you had any thoughts on that, because I think it almost seems like it's impossible to get an impartial jury, and jurors almost need training. You almost don't want them to be just peers, because there aren't enough peers who know how to listen to evidence and really evaluate fairly. So I don't know.
Sure.
Does that have any merit?
This is the kind of thing that is the detail that I didn't get into, because I haven't yet recruited the law professors that I have 200 law professors on my Facebook, and I could chat with them once in a while, but so far I haven't been able to get them to really commit to taking this on. Although 3 law professors did contribute to that document, the draft. I don't know if you noticed that. Dan Farber of Berkeley, and but Dan did it because I'm a friend of Dan Kamen, and Dan Kamen is a friend of Dan Farber, so we kind of helped pull him in. And he did a few things, and you'll see, for example, the 7th Amendment. He worked that over, and a few other habeas corpus. He revised that, and so some of the stuff in there is from real constitutional scholars, but the thing about jury trials, I think, is would be helpful if we had some actual legal scholars on board. But I think that we will, and I think that as I said, we don't have delegates yet. We have formative delegations, but to have an actual delegate, we need what we need is the buy-in from a head of state that says, we're not asking them to be delegates at this point, but just to be in the conversation about the new draft. And so some of those things, some of the nitty-gritty things we haven't gotten to, and I'm not going to get to it, because I think you need to understand jury nullification, for example. I don't know if you know what jury nullification is, but those are important issues that I wouldn't be qualified to really say much about.
There's going to be a million details to work out, that's for sure. I mean, a million different subsections. Yeah.
Not to mention that if you do draft a new constitution, you're also talking about now having to evaluate all this case law that was decided by the old Supreme Court under the old Constitution, right? So what happens to that?
Well, they did that before, though. Obviously, there's a whole new body of case law, and some of it is not going to be relevant. If you look at all this stuff having to do with right to choose, it's all gone, right? And a lot of stuff about energy, about pipelines, and about all of those. A whole lot of case law just isn't going to be applicable anymore. There'll be a lot of new things, good
point. So let me just continue. You mentioned, Alan, about presidential powers limits, right? And I think I want to talk a little bit about that, about the checks and balances system that allows each branch of government to amend or veto acts of another branch, essentially. So to prevent any one branch, like the executive, from exerting too much power. But that, and one of the things here is the judicial review that happens in our government. One of your proposals is to create a new co-executive role with the president for elected attorney general, as we mentioned. I think that's a really interesting idea. So question 5, Alan, what is your reasoning for the change to the attorney general's role more specifically? How do you envision this making a difference in the checks, specifically about checks and balances?
Okay, here's one thing that you will, for example, one prominent professor that I know is on my Facebook, by the way, John Yoo, and he's a conservative. He's on Fox News all the time, and they'll introduce him as assistant attorney general under George Bush, and you made the point that Donald Trump was the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Okay, and you have to kind of think about that. Here's a guy that doesn't know the law, doesn't care about the law, is only looking to how to get around it. And he's the chief law enforcement officer. But that's the structure we have right now.
Good point. Yeah.
And it only kind of works if the president respects that separation. Mm-hmm. Certainly, it wasn't the case with Trump. But Levinson wrote an op-ed piece, and he talked about how ridiculous that point was. I mean, he made this point. He made the same point that the president is the chief law enforcement officer. Right. And he said that in all the states, that's not the way it is. The attorney general is elected. And so, but Levinson didn't say we should have a elected attorney general. But that was my takeaway. I thought, yeah, it should be, and we should stagger it so that he's not elected at the same time. So that that's another part of the separation, that the attorney general is going to serve one 10-year term and will never be elected at the same time the president is elected. And he's probably going to serve 2 or maybe 3 administrations, and he's not going to be looking to get reelected because it's a 1 10-year term. And the attorney generals are going to be candidates are going to be chosen from a pool of, as I put in and this is my wording, I just came up with this, but there would be a commission on attorney general selection that would be a part of Congress, and they would select 20 people from a minimum of 10 states, so that it's not always, so enough states get a shot at it. And then there's no campaigning, no nothing. There are only forums where they each get an equal shot at presenting their case and getting themselves known. Yeah. And that will be publicized so that everybody can read all you want about the attorney general candidates, and then there will be a runoff election and approval voting. In other words, if you go to the polls to vote for attorney general, the first time you're just going to check off the ones you approve. That's approval voting. Right. And then the 2 candidates that have the most, and it's not party. There's no parties part of this. And Democrats, Republicans, it's irrelevant. And so then there's a runoff election, and then the final election between the top 2 candidates. And we don't spend a lot of time on that. I think I gave a month from when the candidates are selected to the final election. So it happens kind of quickly, but everybody gets the discussions for, what attorney generals, what candidates for attorney generals there might be, that will be going on continuously over a long period of time. And so, having that position like that, where it's staggered between administrations, it means that the attorney general is working for the country, not for the president. It's not this loyalty, personal appointment thing, and that's a huge difference. And it's party neutral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's continue on a little bit. Alongside with checks and balances, on another level, it's the idea of federalism. We have a federalist system. Unlike a country like China, which is a unitary government, where the central government has far more control than the provinces do. In our society, in our polity, the states do have a certain amount of power, and that's enshrined in the Constitution. How would you change that, or how would you tweak that in any way?
We're not really changing that much, because this has nothing to do with state governments. What we have to recognize here is that the states made the Constitution, right? It's the state's decision to make the Constitution. It's the state's decision to amend it. And in this case, we're making multiple amendments at the same time. And essentially, we're replacing it, but this is a state's decision. So it's a reassertion of states.
Yes. So you're reaffirming federalism.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And also taking the military-industrial complex out of the picture, which is, as I say, we're practically run by the military-industrial complex. and they're very clever in the way that they place, in the contracts they're placing.
Oh yeah, all over at every state.
Yeah.
And they're buying
constituencies.
They're buying state governments that way. So that's the military-industrial complex is more of a threat to democracy than anything. And Eisenhower made that warning when he left office.
Absolutely. We should
That's
definitely.
That's a speech that I practically got memorized. I mean, it's one of the greatest speeches ever given.
We should definitely devote a whole show to the military-industrial complex. We really should.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, there is an amazing amount of diversity in the world, and governments in the world, about this blend, the sharing of power between the central government and the provinces or local entities, or whether they be provinces, the state, or whatnot. And it makes me think about the global constitution, right? The world constitution, because we would have to have a very robust federal process there, wouldn't you say?
Well, here's one of the big differences.
Okay.
The World Federation does not regulate commerce. Okay, that's a very different thing. In the U.S. Constitution, it's stated very clearly that Congress regulates commerce, and that's a very large function in government.
Sure is.
And the Human Federation does not do that. And the Human Federation has a very narrow role. I mean, it's very powerful. And by the way, I wrote the sovereignty statement. I don't know if you know what it says. You know what it says?
Go ahead and tell us.
It says, this Constitution is the supreme sovereign for all people choosing to be governed by it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's rule of law. In other words, it's stating that we go by the law, and the law is sovereign. And it's up to the people that choose. And this is the other thing that came out of the founding of this country, is that it's the people have to choose to be governed by it, the government. And we've forgotten that. People don't remember that. People look at the government as being all powerful and we can't do anything about it. But that we were based on this country was based on the idea that you have the right to choose to be governed by it. And that was the original idea, and that's what we put in the Human Federation. And it's the supreme sovereign, but it has a limited number of things that it's concerned with.
Okay.
I think it's important when you talk about that, because we hear a lot of this from right libertarians, the idea, well, I never signed a social contract, right? And there are people who will say the sovereign citizen movement in the United States. There are people who claim that they are not bound by the government because they didn't choose to be bound by it. So it's a very careful rhetorical line to walk there when you say consent of the governed or agree to be governed by, because this is a majority. I mean, democracy is majority rule, more or less.
No, it is not.
With minority rights, though, right? Obviously protected by the Constitution. But you couldn't opt out as a if you live in the United States and you are bound by the Constitution whether you want it or not, right? I mean.
Right. Well, here, I want to back up on one thing you said about majority rule. The democracy has three main features in my theory, my constitutional theory. And they're not majority rule. One is equality.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have a democracy without equality.
Right.
Second is rule of law. In other words, we don't go by some individual being have some magic power, right? Talk to Jesus or whatever, signing the Bible, or that doesn't wash. We have rule of law, and we have the third thing is rights,
mm-hmm.
and rights are spelled out. And the government does things, creates laws to secure those rights. And you have to have those three things to have a democracy. Majority rule is not necessarily one of them.
Well, fully understood though. But my point is it creates a conflict when you say consent of the governed, and then you have people who are willing to say, well, I don't consent. But there are a small number of people, they think they can opt out of society. And, there's a story just recently about someone who says they don't recognize property rights, and they could go change the locks on someone's house because the property was on, land that was, it's like an old land claim. My point is that there's this sovereign citizen movement, which I'm sure you're aware of, who will use that exact rhetoric to overturn the government.
Yeah, they're not going to overturn the government. This is a very small people with small group of loudmouths. But the back to what my earlier comment about reaffirming the power of states, we're going to reaffirm the power of citizens, of popular sovereignty, that the people are doing this. And people can say, I wasn't involved in it, and that they can choose not to be involved in it. But it's the choice of the people to exercise their sovereign right to do this. And if people don't want to exercise that or want to do something else, they can do that. But it's weird. This is being established, knowing that not everybody's going to want to go for it. But it's like when this country was founded, it said the Constitution says 9 states have to ratify in order for this Constitution to form a government. And it was known that some of them weren't going to come on board right away, but they did. Rhode Island was maybe the last one, but they gave up the whole notion that we're going to veto the whole Constitution because we didn't agree with it, and it's illegal.
They understood their self-interest ultimately, right? The benefit of being part of this. That's ultimately what happened. But I think this is an interesting point because we're talking about this this fundamental idea about the social contract and citizen responsibility. And to make it work, to make democracy work, you got to get people to buy into that. And you have to make it worth their while. And the idea is that most people will decide out of reason that they're going to do this. Although I think what we're seeing now is there's a lot of actions happening that are not very reasonable, that are really quite irrational. And so there's always that concern. Like, for example, with this pandemic and people not abiding by public health policies, that is an example of that. Yes, do they have the right to do that when it does impact the whole community? When it does, if you don't get everybody vaccinated or most people vaccinated, then the pandemic endures. So I think that's the conundrum.
Well, this is an interesting point. I think this will come out in the wash, and I think it'll come out in the wash in the same way that, you made the point. People ultimately realize it's in their self-interest to go along with it because, and we're going to create a powerful movement. And by the way, I'm going to skip. I want to jump, play hooky here. I'm not going by the book here. But as far as implementing this, we plan to fill stadia. That's what we plan to do. And before we fill stadiums, we have to fill one. But before we can fill one stadium, we've got to have a lot of live events, smaller live events. So it's the answer about how this is going to happen. We're going to build up our meetings. We're going to have more conferences like this, which will be videotaped and broadcast, and then we have live conferences. I go back to my experience with Open Voting Consortium. We really became a force to be reckoned with when we did our first press conference. And my plan was that this was going to go, we were going to be in papers coast to coast. We were going to be on television. We were going to have, and it all happened. All of the things that I said were going to happen, they all happened. And I can see this happening with this also. and we'll build up to that point where we're ready to go coast to coast, and then we'll go with live events. I think there's no substitute for person-to-person contact, and we can have Zoom. We have to do Zoom now, but we're going to go live with personal meetings, and we've got a few things to learn from Bernie too. We know how he did it. I don't know if you ever attended any of his events, but I saw how it was done. And we can do something very similar, and I think we've got the makings of a very powerful movement. And I think that unlike Bernie, Bernie was no radical when it comes to changing the Constitution. He wasn't. I don't think he ever proposed any amendments. And of course, you can't even. Right now, the average politician can't even discuss an amendment because it's going to be shot down. And so the thing is, we're in a position as they were in 1787, where they said we can't change the Articles of Confederation. It's irreparable. It's not functional, and they just had to throw it out and put in a new one. And that's the position we're in right now. There's nothing you can do. Nothing you can do to save the U.S. government.
Well, and because like the last time we tried to amend the Constitution was almost 40 years ago,
right.
And it failed. And it failed because of this concerted opposition from the right and Phyllis Schlafly and the story that we all know, right? And so this is something that it's going to, if there's any chance of any change on our government level, it's going to have to be through something like this.
Yeah, well, and it's going to be the same work to put in a new Constitution as it would be to change one amendment.
Yeah,
that's an interesting point. Yeah,
you might as well.
I mean, it is no longer a living Constitution. It's a static Constitution. It is the principle of being able to change and evolve with the times, which I think the founding fathers had in mind. It doesn't function. It stopped functioning.
Jefferson said every generation deserves a new revolution, and so we're far beyond that. We've passed the point where people think of this as a revolutionary government. It's no longer revolutionary. It's very stagnant and stale.
Yeah.
And there are people who would like to form a constitutional convention to take it in the other direction. They would like to take it back to like an 1850 constitution.
Right. That's fine. That has nothing to do with us.
No.
It has nothing to do with us. They can propose that all they want. They've got the same problem. They have to get 3/4 of the states, and they're not going to get 20 blue states going to make this a theocracy. It's just not going to happen.
And speaking of theocracy, I think we want to talk more about the actionable stuff for sure. But one last item that I want to talk about first, and we can get to the action, and that is the issue that we are defined here as a functionally an established secular society. As many of the world's, most advanced economic countries are. This is particularly important considering the tenor of the discourse and the policy direction that the GOP has taken, as you both have mentioned a few minutes ago, right? With essentially the intent of trying to reestablish and solidifying Christian supremacy. What else can you call it? How do we ensure that official secularism is, invigorated in your Constitution?
Well, right. A couple of things about that. One, I didn't mention. I don't know if Sean mentioned it, but our Constitution does say that there shall be no religious test for anybody employed by the government, and that is we have that, and we have a secular Constitution, and so we need to hang on to that for sure. But the other thing, this is. Some people roll their eyes when I talk about it, but did you read the Paul Kurtz quote?
I saw that you quoted him, but I don't remember what it was.
Paul Kurtz endorsed the year zero.
Yes, that's
year
it.
zero.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he said that why impose a religious calendar on people when we don't know if Christ was born or even ever existed. I mean, it's all based on the myth of his birth, which is pure myth. And that was constructed centuries after the event.
Right.
And a lot of people are astonished to know that no government mentions the Anno Domino, the AD numbering system, until 800, and that was Charlemagne. And his basic tool to make the country Christian was to kill anybody that didn't want to go along. And but that's Christianity. And and I also in I think in one of my letters, I had this website, the Year Zero campaign, and I got thousands of emails. This is in the 1996 I started this, and it lasted all the way to 2000. And but that was all this stuff came out, and what we found was there's something called Christian triumphalism, and you don't hear a lot about it, but if you try to tell people you don't want to go by the Christian era calendar, which celebrates, even though they call it Common Era, right? Christians are fine with it CE because they think of it as Christian era, and they have a point that the numbering is supposedly based on his birth, which is purely a myth. But so Kurt said, "You're right. Let's start anew. Let's start this is a new era, and let's start a new era." So, and that was what my proposal was from 1996, and it was actually I was in all the papers. I wasn't in the New York Times. On that one, the New York Times did an in-depth interview with me in 1999, but they didn't write the article. They didn't publish the article. I was surprised because it sounded like they were going to, but the Associated Press certainly did, and they wrote an article leading up to 2000, and they wrote one in around New Year's of 2002, and it's an incredible article. I sent you a link to it. It's a full page. It was in practically every paper, every major paper in the world. And some guy from Taiwan sent me a copy, and but it basically endorsed the concept that I put forward, and I put Kurtz endorsed the idea of a cultural reset, which is what which I talked about and I still talk about, but the original proposal was a mathematical thing. Had to do with the math, and I said that most people are going to be celebrating the new year on the 0 year, or the new millennium on the 0 year, and that's not right. It was because it started with 1, and the full page Associated Press article, which was timely and carefully worded. They had to wait until after the New Year's in 2001 because the claim was that the 0 year would be celebrated and the 1 year wouldn't be, and so we had to wait and see that happen. And guess what? The 0 year was celebrated, and so the Associated Press made the point that people argued that was wrong, but most of the world chose to celebrate a fresh chapter in time.
I remember that. Yeah,
I remember the controversy too. And by the way, there is a Nine Inch Nails album called Year Zero. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's not a bad album actually. It's pretty good. It's all about dictatorship and some of the things that we're fighting in the 21st century. He was pretty ahead of his time with that. Came out, I think, during the Bush administration. But, I think it's a good point that you're making, though, about Christian triumphalism, and in the sense that, they claim persecution if they are not at the center of everything, including government. And so that's why it's a good thing that the no religious test is in the Constitution. However, what they do what they have been doing quite a lot of is going down the road of using the free exercise clause to grant themselves a wide variety of religious exemptions to civil law. And that's, and as a matter of fact, what this current Supreme Court is getting ready to do in an even worse way. And during the pandemic, you saw it. You saw a lot of religious requests for gatherings that had been shut down by public health departments, getting religious exemptions to gather, even though they were passing the virus around. And so it seems to me like there needs to be something specific in a new constitution saying that there can be no religious privilege granted to any religious group, because otherwise every religious group, whoever's the most powerful, tries to get their religious privilege written into law. What do you have to say about that?
I think that's a good idea. I don't. I'm not sure if this would be. It may be that there would be laws that would be tied to the. It's no longer the First Amendment. It's in the Bill of Rights. I just took the First Amendment and put it in the Bill of Rights, but it may be laws that are attached to that, and maybe that wording needs to be altered too. Because it doesn't say. Says we don't respect establishment of a state religion, but we don't
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and that's what they hang their hat on.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the wording might be tweaked on that. That's a possibility, and that would be something that again, it's like several things. I never felt comfortable writing any of it, but I had to write a lot. But I don't want to. I would want to get some real authorities on that topic, and get the wording just exactly the way we want it. But I'm fully sympathetic with that. But we're going to be reasserting the popular sovereignty, and I think that this changes a lot of things, and the calendar will change a lot of things too. And if people think that it doesn't matter, just look at some of the writing. There was an article. I don't know if you read the World Magazine article. You should read it if you haven't. Did you?
Mm-hmm. I read everything you sent me.
Yeah. It starts off saying, if secularists can call for taking God out of the public schools, why not take Christ out of the calendar?
Yeah, good idea.
But they were being sarcastic, right?
Right.
But so they were denouncing me, and they denounced Paul Kurtz, because Paul Kurtz, that was after his testimonial, and but in the end they never interviewed me too. That's how you're dealing with trash writers, is that they don't bother to interview you. And all of the better articles were from people that actually took the time to interview me, because they got basic things wrong in that article, but you can see them, trying to examine the logic. And they said, if computers can think it's zero, why not people? That was one of their comments. Well, I never said that, because I'm a computer engineer, and I knew that was nonsense from day one, and that it had nothing to do with anything. But that was kind of a popular idea, that computers think it's the year zero, and it's baloney. But the other thing is but they came up with that. I never said that. Then they also said that this would be the beginning of the computer era. That was the last sentence. And so that they're trying to fathom what the logic of this and make up their own reasoning. But that's not what we were saying. But it's not, it's not bad. It's this computer era. They didn't have computers 2,000 years ago. But there's I actually, and another thing that I don't mention and that you won't see very much of, and that is in my slide presentation, I called it the global era, and I'll just mention that here, that global era was suggested by one of my academic partners, Richard Landis, who's a historian at Boston University, And initially I said, okay, well, that sounds good. We'll go with that. But I later decided that Solar Era was better. And I haven't talked to him in a long time, but the last I heard from him, he's writing a book on this. He's written many books, by the way. He's a historian. And he's writing a book just on this point. So that'll be interesting to read. He's living in Jerusalem, and he's no longer teaching at Boston University. I don't know. I haven't heard from him, so I don't know exactly. But it's something to look forward to, his book. But because he was deeply steeped in all of the millennialism and calendars. You know, that there have been many calendars historically, and it really is a cultural thing. I mean, cultures have their own calendar.
Yeah, it's a very much of an expression of political power. It's an expression of political power if you get to make your calendar be the calendar, right? It's
in more ways than people realize.
Politically, it's very powerful. And for millennia, cultures had their own calendar. They had their own way of, and there was no need to think about the calendar on the other side of the world because they never went there. Right. But it's really in the 20th century when we have global communications, global transportation. You go to an airport, you gotta have one thing on your arrival time, not in multiple systems, and so it's a very powerful thing, and I think that the people have no idea because yes, what time is it? What day is it? You just look on your phone or whatever, and you know what it is. But that was a cultures developed figuring that out, out what time it is and what day it is.
It's just like the water.
The development of math and science.
It's like the water we're swimming in. We don't notice how powerful it is, and we don't notice that we all subconsciously think back to Christ every time we write the date. Right? It's something that is it's definitely something of Christian supremacy.
Alan, let's give you the floor to talk about actions. Like, what can our viewers think about and do? What can we do as citizens of the world and of the United States? Like, what are some just actionable ideas?
Right. Well, I mean, I would guide people to our website, and also we have a page on Facebook. It's called HF, as in Human Federation, .discuss. Actually, you don't need the dot, but you can just say HF discuss. But there's a page in there for every state in the United States and every for about 50 countries, they're pretty much dormant, but there's been some activity, and there's some. And interestingly, the country of Ghana is there's a pretty active group there, and
Ghana's a cool country.
It is.
Ethiopia, our page for Ethiopia has 500 likes. It's still pretty small, but that's where the African Union is. And that's 55 countries, 1.2 billion people there.
Yeah.
And I think that there's the potential, on our webpage, if you go straight to the answer.fyi, you'll see a bunch of images of war that flashes on a TV, and you get out of that. You click on the we call it a Easter egg, right, in computer science.
Right. But
you click on the logo, and you'll hear people making their pledge requests. In other words, it's individual citizens asking their head of state to get involved.
Yeah, I saw that.
It's not exactly saying provide a delegate for this convention, because we're not quite there yet. But we want these are formative delegations, and so that's something that people can do. They can make a pledge request, and all you got to do, it's all written out. It's the same wording. Everybody says the same thing. What we're after is we want to make it look like everybody in the world is saying the same thing. And of those pledge requests, there's only 4 of them up there right now, but they're from 4 different countries, and there's a guy in Africa who Hafiz is he's actually our secretary, and Tim Mayer is in San Francisco. He's actually our treasurer. He's one of my closest friends. But it's not quite fair. But he's not impartial. He goes. We go back to Open Voting Consortium. He was one of my right-hand guys back then. But so he's making the pledge request, and he's out. You can see the Golden Gate Bridge there, and you can hear the water. It's really, that's kind of what we really want to see is people. So you can look at it and see people making this request earnestly, and you can kind of see where they're at, who they are. And although there's a guy in Pakistan, he's doing it just sitting at his computer. It's all right. It's whatever. That's what he felt like doing. So it's whatever people want to do. But Entella, the woman in Italy, the comment so far is that she's the best. But you can try to top Entella because she's just a lovely woman, and she's in a square in Italy, and it's obviously it's Italy, and she's speaking Italian, and Italian is a beautiful language.
It is a beautiful language. I speak Italian. I understood her perfectly.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so you listened? Okay, good. So we would like to see those. I mean, if somebody doesn't know what to do, just read the pledge request and do it in your language and put it on YouTube.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is, on the one hand, is really a classic grassroots approach, right? So we're talking about people, and then people speaking upwards, and making governments listen, and to get people to get motivated to do that, you have all this idea about getting people together both online and in person in small groups, then eventually into larger groups, into stadiums, and begin a movement that way. And we should think about like what are good historical models for that, because there are lots of interesting social movements models that have done similar things, and we could learn from that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We want to learn from all of them, and Bernie is an example, but there's lots of others that did things differently too. But I'll never forget standing in line at a Bernie event, and I thought it was beautiful. The ticket is just somebody zapped the barcode on your cell phone, and then they've got all the information. And we want something like that where it's low overhead, and we will be asking for proof that they're vaccinated to be in an in-person event.
Absolutely.
Well, here's what my thoughts are about this. I'm thinking of the Arab Spring and what happened there, and how these technologies were an incredible means for citizens for the first time to be able to organize, because the police states had blocked all these avenues for citizen organization. All of a sudden you had these new technologies, and overnight you had these governments collapsing. But what happened was it didn't ever sustain. It fizzled out because there was nothing substantial behind it, right? There was it was nothing like the grassroots movement we saw in the civil rights era behind it. And I think so that we have to think about maybe having these tiered structures, right, to be able to really keep it sustainable.
Right. Well, we have to right now, I want to build some coalition with women in Texas. Okay. Because,
yes.
And so that there are segments in our society that would latch onto this and wouldn't even care about the rest of it. If you federalized Roe v. Wade, they'd be happy. And other people, I think people of color, when they hear the pitch that we have about racism, that this is a racist culture, and we were racist from the beginning. I mean, look at Native Americans, look at blacks, and look at Asians, how they have been treated. We want to, and look at the result from World War I when we refused to grant Japan's request for a statement of equality. I think that there's something there that they can people of color can latch onto, that it would be as passionately attached to as women that want to see Roe v. Wade federalized. And so there are lots of things like that. I think the whole environmental movement would like.
There are so many constituencies with this, and if you look at the original Constitution, it is so flawed and it is so racist, and the fact that it had to get patched up with all these amendments in order to even be sort of halfway acceptable, and the fact that the Equal Rights Amendment failed, these are all very, very good sales pitches to start from scratch and do something better. And I really like the idea that this is open source, because I can sit here and I can have my issues with the text. Other people can have their issues with the text. It gets hammered out, and we come up with something that, is, I guess, least offensive to everyone that everybody can sign on to.
On the point of open source, I've been involved in some big software development projects with Intel and Borland, and we use bug tracking software, and I know how that works. And this is, to me, this Constitution is a piece of software. I mean, it's not like software. It is software. And I would plan to be using an open source bug tracking system called Bugzilla. And so that what would happen is, if you have an issue, you send it in, and then the director of QA, the QA director, hands it off to a developer. In this case, would probably be a constitutional scholar, and then that person responds to it. And then in software development, what happens is the bugs come in, and we have what we used to call bug scrub meeting, and all the developers and the QA people would get together, and you'd go through each bug and talk about it, and then a new release comes out. It's not that they make a final decision, okay? Because when you're doing software development, there's a new version of the software every day, and that's a process that we go through, and it's an iterative process. This is the way that I see this happening: is that we take all the bug reports, or what we would call problem reports. In some of I think at Borland we call them bug reports, and Intel they're problem reports. In this case, I think problem reports, but they're bugs. And then we would have I think the Constitution that's out there today says August 31st. That was the last time I changed anything. And I think what you would see is that there would be a new one every day.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. It really is. We'd
be taking in all of this information, processing it, and assigning it to people who have expertise in the area, and make some tweaks. And if something needs to be added, if there's a new article that needs to be added, well, it will be added.
I'll tell you, we've gone through a whole bunch of stuff here that's really interesting and provocative, and we need to think about this more. And I would definitely suggest people check out Alan's sites and his project. Thank you so much, Alan, for spending this time with us today. This has been really enlightening, and I think we need to do another hour, with you sometimes very soon, to talk about proposals for the global constitution of the human federation, let's say. This is all very mind-expanding in terms of possibilities. Is there anything else you'd like to say here that we haven't covered yet today? Any closing thoughts from either of you, actually?
The thing that I'm after with this program is to get another one.
Okay.
Not necessarily with you guys, although you guys are great, but maybe another Sean Prophet and Joe. I don't know if I can say your last name, but to get another one, and then those would be increasing in terms of, this is a small audience. I don't know what your audience is, but we want to see increasingly large audiences, and then move on to live events. So anybody that can think of how they can help that process, that's what I'm after. I mean, write to me.
Yeah.
My contact information is no secret.
I know that I would like to, it's something that I would like to be involved in on an ongoing basis. Sounds to me, the more the organizational structure can evolve, and the more that people can know, it's like, hey, if I want to do something, what do I do? How do I move this ball forward? And you saw the list of concerns and questions that I submitted, and I'm sure that as there are a lot of people, as soon as you get this creativity unleashed, or people start actually thinking, hey, we can change things, right? All of a sudden, there's a place for everyone to be involved, and I think the organization is going to be key.
Yeah, well stated. I concur in everything you said there, Sean. And what I want to say, folks, that's our show for today. Remember, if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Joe Kipinti. Thank you for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
The Radical Secular podcast is written and produced by Christoph Defoe, Sean Prophet, Joe Okipinti, and Drew Scott. Artwork and design by Tim Stetner. Post-production and theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.